My parents forced me to claim my sister was my daughter. The truth was revealed at their anniversary party. I was 18 and about to start college when my mom had my sister Ruby. My parents were 45 and 47, and the pregnancy was a complete accident. Mom was mortified when she found out. She was the regional director at her company, and my dad had just made partner at his law firm. They spent 9 months telling no one except me. Mom wore loose clothes, worked from home during the last trimester, and told her office she had back surgery. When Ruby was born, my parents brought her home and told me the plan. I was going to tell everyone Ruby was mine. They said it was temporary, just until they figured things out. They'd already told the neighbors I'd gotten pregnant in high school and was keeping the baby. I hadn't even had a boyfriend. They enrolled Ruby at daycare under my name. Put me on all her medical forms as the mother. When I said this was insane, Dad said I owed them for 18 years of raising me, and this was my chance to pay them back. Mom said if I didn't agree, they wouldn't pay for college. I needed that degree to get away from them, so I agreed. The story they told everyone was that I'd gotten pregnant senior year, and the father disappeared. They were being supportive grandparents, letting me and my baby live with them. Mom would cry to her friends about how hard it was watching her teenage daughter struggle with motherhood. Dad told his partners he was heartbroken but standing by me. They got so much sympathy and praise for not kicking me out. Meanwhile, I was the teen mom who ruined her life. My high school friends stopped talking to me because their parents didn't want them around a bad influence. My relatives whispered about me at family events. My grandmother sent me pamphlets about adoption and said I was selfish for keeping Ruby when I couldn't provide for her. I couldn't date because what guy wants an 18-year-old with a baby? I started college locally because my parents said I needed to be home for Ruby. They'd drop her at daycare, but I had to pick her up. If she was sick, I missed classes. Professors would see me with a baby and assume I was irresponsible. One actually said in front of the whole class that maybe I should have thought about education before having unprotected sex. My mom would post on social media about the sacrifices she made helping her daughter raise a baby. She'd share articles about grandparents raising grandchildren with captions about doing what's right for family. Her friends would comment about what an angel she was. Dad would bring Ruby to his office sometimes and let everyone fawn over his granddaughter while shaking his head sadly about his daughter's mistakes. They'd have me bring Ruby to their work events so everyone could see their burden. People would look at me with pity or disgust while my parents got praised for their support. At Ruby's first birthday, my parents threw a huge party. They invited all their friends and made me stand there holding Ruby while they talked about the challenges of having a grandchild so young. I wanted to scream the truth, but my parents had made it clear that college funding depended on maintaining the lie. For 3 years, this continued. I couldn't transfer to a better school because I was Ruby's mother on paper. I couldn't study abroad. I couldn't take internships that required travel. My transcript had gaps from all the times I had to handle Ruby's needs. My parents, meanwhile, told everyone how proud they were for supporting me despite my mistakes. When Ruby turned 4, she started asking questions. My parents told her to call me Mama and them Grandma and Grandpa. But at home, when no one was around, they'd parent her and treat me like a sister. My parents would get annoyed when Ruby wanted me instead of them, saying I was confusing her by trying to act like her mother. The breaking point came when Ruby started kindergarten. The teacher conference request came to me since I was listed as her mother. When I showed up, my mom was already there. She told the teacher she handled education decisions as the grandmother since I was too young to understand. The teacher looked at me with such pity. She actually offered to connect me with resources for teen mothers trying to finish their education. That night, I told my parents I was done. They said Ruby was starting to understand things and changing the story now would traumatize her. They said I'd already sacrificed 5 years. What was 13 more until she was 18? They promised they'd make it worth my while in their will. That's when I knew exactly when to tell the truth. My parents' 30th anniversary was coming up. They'd rented a ballroom, invited 200 people, planned speeches about their journey as parents and grandparents. They asked me to bring Ruby so everyone could see their beautiful granddaughter they'd helped raise. During the slideshow of their life together, there was a whole section about becoming grandparents and supporting their teen daughter. Photos of them with Ruby while I stood in the background looking ashamed. The crowd was murmuring about how strong they were. When it came time for speeches, I wasn't supposed to speak. But I stood up anyway with Ruby and walked to the microphone. I said I wanted to thank my parents for raising both their daughters with such love. Then I turned to Ruby and said I had something important to tell her. I looked down at Ruby's confused face and took a deep breath. The words came out steady even though my hands were shaking. Ruby, you're not my daughter. You're my little sister. The people you call Grandma and Grandpa are actually your mom and dad. The ballroom went completely silent. I could hear someone's phone buzz across the room. Ruby's face started to crumple like paper being crushed. Her little mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. 200 guests just stared at us. Some had their forks halfway to their mouths. Others had stopped mid-conversation with their wine glasses frozen in the air. My mom's face went white, then red, then white again. She lunged toward the microphone and tried to grab it from me. I stepped back and kept talking. My parents forced me to claim Ruby as mine when I was 18. They threatened to cut off my college funding if I refused. They were ashamed of having a baby at their age, so they made me take the blame for it. Mom's fingers caught the microphone cord, but I pulled it away. Dad was standing now, his chair knocked backward. Mom was making these gasping sounds like she couldn't breathe. I kept going. They put my name on all her documents, made me pick her up from daycare, made me miss classes when she was sick. They got praised for being supportive grandparents while everyone treated me like I'd ruined my life. Ruby started crying. Her little voice broke my heart into pieces. Why did you lie to me? Why did everyone lie? I knelt down right there on the stage and pulled her close. I never wanted to lie to you. I love you so much, and I'm so sorry. My dad's voice boomed across the ballroom. Stop making a scene. Get down from there right now. Ruby was sobbing into my shoulder. Her whole body was shaking. I could feel her tears soaking through my dress. The guests were pulling out their phones now. I saw at least 20 people recording. Suzanne from Mom's office had gone pale. Her mouth was hanging open. She'd spent years telling my mom how amazing she was for helping me. All those lunch conversations about the challenges of supporting a teen mom. All those sympathetic looks she'd given me at company events. All lies. My mom started shouting, "She's having a breakdown. Please don't listen to her. She's not well. She needs help." But her voice sounded wrong. Too high. Too desperate. Conrad from Dad's law firm stood up. His chair scraped loud against the floor. He looked right at my dad. Is what she's saying true? Did you really do this? My dad's face turned bright red. His mouth opened and closed. This is a family matter. This isn't the appropriate venue for this discussion. We can talk about this privately. Conrad just stared at him. That's not a no. My dad started stammering about privacy and boundaries, about how family issues shouldn't be aired in public. But everyone could see the truth on his face. He wasn't denying it. He was just mad I'd told. The crowd started murmuring. Phones were everywhere now. Someone near the back was live streaming. I could see the little red recording dot on their screen. Elena pushed through the crowd. She had tears running down her face. She came right up to the stage. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I abandoned you in high school. I always thought something felt wrong about the whole thing, but my parents made me stay away. Her voice cracked. I should have been a better friend. I should have questioned it. My grandmother was making her way toward the stage too. She looked like someone had slapped her. She walked right up to my mother. Did you really do this to her? Did you really make your daughter pretend your baby was hers? Mom tried to explain. It was complicated. We were protecting our careers. We couldn't have people knowing we had an unplanned pregnancy at our age. But grandmother cut her off. You're a coward. You made a child carry your shame. Ruby was clinging to me so tight I could barely breathe. Her face was buried in my neck. She kept asking the same questions over and over. Are you really my sister? Why did everyone lie? Who's my real mom? I held her and rocked her. I'll explain everything in a way you can understand, I promise. But right now we need to leave this party. I picked her up. She wrapped her legs around my waist like she used to when she was smaller. I started walking toward the exit. My parents came after us immediately. Dad was yelling about legal action, about how I'd stolen his daughter, about how I'd pay for this. Mom was crying and saying I'd ruined everything. 30 years of marriage destroyed, her reputation gone. How could I do this to them? Half the guests followed us with their phones out. The other half just sat there looking stunned. I could hear whispered conversations starting behind us. Did you know about this? I always thought something was off. Poor girl. Those horrible parents. Elena caught up with me at the door. Her hand touched my arm. Let me drive you. You're shaking too hard to drive safely. Her parents were right behind her. Delilah grabbed Elena's other arm. You're not getting involved in this mess. This isn't our problem. But Elena pulled away. I'm 23 years old and I'm making my own choices now. She looked at me. Where's your car? I pointed to the parking lot. She took Ruby from my arms for a second while I fumbled for my keys. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped them twice. Elena picked them up and put them in her pocket. I'm driving. She helped me get Ruby into her car seat. Ruby was still crying but quieter now. More like hiccups than sobs. My parents were in the parking lot now. Other guests were streaming out behind them. Phones were still recording everything. Elena got in the driver's seat and locked the doors. She started the engine. My dad banged on the window. You can't take her. I'll call the police. Elena just drove away. I stared out the car window as streetlights blurred past. Ruby's crying had faded to soft hiccups against my shoulder. Her small body felt heavy with exhaustion. Elena kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror. She didn't say anything, just drove. We pulled up to an apartment building about 15 minutes from the ballroom. Elena parked and came around to help me with Ruby. My legs felt shaky when I stood up. Ruby's head lolled against my neck. She was completely asleep now. Elena unlocked her apartment door and flipped on the lights. The place was small but neat. She grabbed blankets from a closet and started making up the couch. I just stood there holding Ruby. My arms were getting tired, but I didn't want to put her down. Elena took some pillows and arranged them so Ruby wouldn't roll off. I finally laid her down and covered her with a blanket. She didn't even stir. My phone started buzzing in my pocket. I pulled it out and the screen was full of notifications, texts, missed calls, voicemails. I watched the numbers climb. Elena touched my arm and I jumped. She pointed to her bedroom and I followed her in. She closed the door quietly. The buzzing continued. I sat on the edge of her bed and started scrolling through the messages. My aunt's name appeared 3 times. I opened her texts first. The first one called me selfish. Said I traumatized a 5-year-old at a public event. Said I should be ashamed of myself for putting my anger ahead of Ruby's well-being. The second message said I was just like my parents, using Ruby for my own purposes. The third one said she hoped I was happy now that I'd destroyed the family. I deleted all 3 without responding. My cousin's texts were different. She said she always knew something was wrong with the story. Said my parents' version never made sense. Said she was sorry she didn't reach out sooner. Said if I needed anything to let her know. I saved those messages. More texts kept coming in. An uncle asking what really happened. A former neighbor saying she felt terrible for judging me. My mom's sister demanding I bring Ruby home immediately. Someone from my dad's office asking if the story was true. I turned off my phone and put it face down on the bed. Elena sat next to me. She didn't try to hug me or say anything comforting. She just sat there. That's when I started crying. Not the quiet tears from the ballroom. Real crying. The kind that makes your whole body shake. 5 years of holding everything in came pouring out. I cried about missing my friends. About the professors who looked at me with pity. About the guys who wouldn't date me. About the internships I couldn't take. About watching my parents get praised while everyone whispered about me. Elena put her arm around my shoulders. She said she was so sorry. Said she should have known something was wrong. Said she was a terrible friend for abandoning me. I told her it wasn't her fault. My parents were convincing. Everyone believed them. She squeezed my hand and said that didn't make it okay. Said she should have at least tried to stay in touch. Said she let her parents make decisions for her when she should have thought for herself. We sat there for a long time. I cried until my head hurt and my eyes felt swollen. Elena got me some water and tissues. Eventually, I stopped shaking. My phone was still face down on the bed. I didn't want to look at it again. Elena said I could sleep in her room and she'd take the chair in the living room. I said no. Said I needed to be near Ruby in case she woke up. We went back to the living room. Ruby was still asleep on the couch. Her face looked peaceful, like she wasn't carrying the weight of what she'd learned tonight. I sat on the floor next to the couch. Elena brought me a pillow and another blanket. She curled up in the chair with her own blanket. Neither of us talked. The apartment was quiet except for Ruby's breathing. I must have dozed off because I woke up to Ruby calling out. The clock on the wall said it was just after midnight. Ruby was sitting up on the couch looking around with wide eyes. She saw me on the floor and reached for me. I climbed up onto the couch next to her. She wrapped her arms around my neck. Then she started to say mama but stopped herself. Her little face scrunched up in confusion. She asked what she should call me now. My throat felt tight. I told her she could call me whatever felt right. Said we'd figure everything out together. Said it didn't have to be decided tonight. She was quiet for a minute. Then she asked if I was really her sister. I said yes. Asked if that was okay. She nodded against my shoulder. Said she always wanted a big sister. Said some of her friends at the school had big sisters and she thought it would be nice. I held her tighter. Told her I loved her no matter what she called me. She said she loved me too. Then she asked where Grandma and Grandpa were. I corrected her quietly. Said they were her mom and dad. She made a confused sound. Asked why they didn't want people to know. I said they made a mistake. Said sometimes grown-ups make bad choices because they're scared. Said it didn't mean anything was wrong with her. She asked if they still loved her. I promised they did. Said they just handled things the wrong way. She seemed to accept that. Asked if we could stay here tonight. I said yes. She settled back against me and closed her eyes. Within minutes, she was asleep again. I stayed awake. Couldn't stop thinking about what came next. Morning arrived too fast. Sunlight came through the windows. Ruby woke up and asked for breakfast. Elena made toast and found some juice in her fridge. Ruby ate quietly. Kept looking at me like she was checking to make sure I was still there. Someone knocked on the apartment door. Hard. Loud. My dad's voice came through demanding I open up. Said I needed to return Ruby right now. My mom was with him. I could hear her voice too. Higher pitched. Almost hysterical. Elena looked at me. I shook my head. Walked to the door but didn't open it. Told them through the wood that Ruby needed time. needed space to process everything. Dad's voice got louder, said I had no right to keep his daughter from him. Mom said I was being cruel, said Ruby needed her parents. I stayed calm, said Ruby needed time away from the people who lied to her for 5 years, said she'd see them when she was ready. Dad started yelling about calling the police, said Ruby was legally their daughter, said I was kidnapping her, said I'd go to jail for this. I pulled out my phone and started recording, held it up to the door, asked him to repeat that, asked him to say again that Ruby was his daughter, not his granddaughter, his daughter. There was silence on the other side. Then I heard my mom's voice, quieter now, telling him to stop, saying this wasn't helping. Dad tried the door handle. It was locked. He pounded on the door again. Elena came up behind me. She said loudly enough for them to hear that if they didn't leave, she was calling the police herself. Said they were disturbing her neighbors. Said harassment was illegal. The pounding stopped. I heard footsteps walking away. Elena looked through the peephole and nodded. They were gone. I stopped the recording and saved it. Ruby was standing in the middle of the living room. She'd heard everything. Her eyes were big and scared. I went to her and knelt down, told her everything was going to be okay. About an hour later, there was another knock. Softer this time. A woman's voice asked if Elena was home. Elena looked surprised. She opened the door. It was her mom. Delilah stood in the hallway looking uncomfortable. She saw me and her expression changed. She came inside and closed the door. Then she looked right at me and said she was sorry. Said she was sorry for how she treated me 5 years ago. Said she was sorry for keeping Elena away from me. Said she was a mother herself, and she was horrified by what my parents did. Said if I needed any help at all, she wanted to provide it. I didn't know what to say. Delilah had been one of the people who made sure I stayed isolated, who told other parents to keep their kids away from me. Now she was apologizing. She said she knew someone who could help, a therapist who worked with kids dealing with family problems. Said she'd make the call if I wanted. I looked at Ruby. She needed professional help processing this. I nodded. Delilah pulled out her phone right there and made the appointment. Got us in for that afternoon. She wrote down the address and handed it to me. Then she hugged me. It felt strange. I took Ruby to the therapist's office later that day. The waiting room had toys and kids' books. The therapist came out to meet us. She was younger than I expected. She smiled at Ruby and asked if she wanted to come talk for a bit. Ruby looked at me. I told her it was okay, that this nice lady just wanted to help her feel better about everything that happened. Ruby went with her. I sat in the waiting room and waited. Checked my phone. My parents had called 6 more times. I ignored all of them. Checked social media instead. My mom's page was full of comments on her anniversary posts. People asking questions, asking for explanations. Some of her friends had unfriended her. I could see that the number of friends on her profile had dropped. Suzanne had posted something vague about being disappointed in people she trusted. Didn't name anyone, but the timing was obvious. People were commenting, asking what happened. She wasn't responding. My dad's page was private, so I couldn't see what was happening there. But I imagined it was similar. Their carefully built reputation was falling apart. The therapist brought Ruby back out after 40 minutes. Said Ruby did great. Gave me some information about helping kids process family trauma. Said we should come back next week. Ruby held my hand on the way to the car. Said the therapist was nice. Said she got to draw pictures about her feelings. My phone rang. Not my parents this time. A number I recognized. Dad's law partner. I answered. Conrad's voice was serious. Said he needed to understand what happened at the party. Said as my dad's partner, he had to know the truth. I told him everything. The whole story from when I was 18 until now. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then he said this explained a lot. Said my dad had been secretive about certain family matters. Said things that seemed odd at the time made sense now. He thanked me for being honest and hung up. I sat in the car with Ruby, wondered what would happen next. Knew this was just the beginning. The next day, Ruby climbed into my lap while I was checking my phone at Elena's apartment. She looked up at me with those big eyes and asked why her real mom and dad didn't want people to know about her. My chest tightened. How do you explain something like that to a 5-year-old? I pulled her closer and told her they made a mistake because they were scared, but that doesn't mean anything is wrong with her. She's perfect and wonderful, and the problem was never about her. She nodded, but I could see she didn't fully understand. She asked if they were scared of her. I said no. They were scared of what other people would think, which was a grown-up problem that had nothing to do with how special she is. She seemed to accept that for now. I kissed the top of her head and hoped the therapist could help her process this better than I could. My phone buzzed with an email notification. The sender name made me freeze. Professor Archer. My stomach dropped, remembering her comment in class about unprotected sex. I opened it, expecting more judgment. Instead, she apologized. She'd seen posts about the party online and realized the truth. She said she was sorry for her comment and asked if there was anything she could do to help me get back on track with school. I read it 3 times. She included her office hours and said she'd write recommendation letters or help me transfer if I wanted. I sat there staring at the screen. One apology couldn't erase 5 years of people assuming the worst about me. But it was something. I wrote back thanking her and said I'd think about it. 2 days later, a thick envelope arrived at Elena's apartment. The return address was a law firm I didn't recognize. My hands shook as I opened it. The letter inside demanded Ruby's return immediately. It said I was emotionally unstable and unfit to care for her. It used my public revelation at the party as evidence that I was having a breakdown. The letter threatened custody action if I didn't comply within 48 hours. I read it twice and felt sick. My parents had hired a lawyer. They were actually going to fight me for Ruby. Elena read it over my shoulder and said we needed to get our own lawyer right away. I'd been saving money from my part-time job at the campus bookstore for 2 years. It wasn't much, but it was enough to pay for a consultation. I found a family lawyer who could see me that afternoon. Her office was small but neat. She listened to everything and took notes. Then she reviewed the letter from my parents' lawyer. She said their case was complicated by the fact that they'd spent 5 years establishing me as Ruby's mother on legal documents. They couldn't just claim I was unfit when they'd put my name on everything. She asked if I had copies of Ruby's paperwork. I said I could get them. The lawyer leaned back in her chair and explained something I hadn't considered. My parents committed fraud by putting my name on Ruby's birth certificate and medical forms. This could actually work in my favor if they tried to pursue custody. They created the legal confusion themselves. She said we had options, but I needed to decide what I actually wanted. Did I want custody of Ruby, or did I want her with my parents, but with my role as sister recognized? I told her I wanted what was best for Ruby. She said that was good, but I needed to think about it more specifically. We scheduled another meeting for the following week. Ruby's kindergarten teacher called the next morning. She said she needed to meet with me to discuss the family situation. Ruby had been telling other kids that she found out her mom is actually her sister, and she doesn't know who her real family is. The other kids were confused, and some parents had questions. The teacher's voice was kind but concerned. She said Ruby seemed upset and the school counselor wanted to get involved. I agreed to come in that afternoon. I sat across from the teacher in her classroom after school ended. I explained the whole situation honestly. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said she was sympathetic and would work with the school counselor to support Ruby. But she needed clarity on who had legal authority to make decisions about Ruby's education. Right now, all the forms listed me as mother. If that was changing, she needed updated paperwork. I told her I was working with a lawyer to sort everything out. She said to let her know as soon as possible because Ruby needed consistency. My phone started blowing up with notifications that evening. My parents were posting on social media. Mom's post talked about how hard it is to watch someone you care about have a mental health crisis. She didn't name me, but everyone knew who she meant. Dad shared an article about family conflict and the importance of professional help. Then I saw that Kendall Morris had posted something about watching someone spiral and refuse help. The comments were full of people expressing concern and support for my parents. Nobody knew the real story. They were spinning a new narrative where I was the unstable one. Elena came into the living room and showed me her phone. She'd been screenshotting my parents' old social media posts, all the ones where they took credit for raising their granddaughter. All the posts accepting praise for supporting their teen daughter. She'd saved dozens of them. The posts clearly showed them claiming to be devoted grandparents. She sent them all to my email and said this was evidence. They couldn't pretend now that they'd always said Ruby was their daughter. The internet doesn't forget. A knock on the apartment door made us both jump. Elena looked through the peephole and then opened it. My grandmother stood there holding a casserole dish. She came inside and gave me a long hug. Then she knelt down in front of Ruby and said she's her grandma no matter what. That families can be complicated, but love doesn't change. Ruby hugged her tight. Grandmother stood up and told me she'd been thinking about everything since the party. She said she was angry at my parents for what they did to both of us. She asked what she could do to help. I told grandmother she could help by being there for Ruby and making sure my parents kept their promises. Ruby climbed into grandmother's lap and asked why she sent those papers about giving babies away. Grandmother's eyes filled with tears and she held Ruby close. She said she was so sorry, that she believed the lies just like everyone else did. She thought she was helping by suggesting adoption because she didn't know I was actually Ruby's sister. Grandmother looked at me and said she was angry at my parents for making her treat me that way, for making her think terrible things about me when I was just a kid trying to survive their scheme. Ruby asked if grandmother was mad at her and grandmother said no, never, that none of this was Ruby's fault. She promised Ruby that she was her grandma no matter what, and that wouldn't change. After grandmother left, I started making a list of everything I needed. Daycare records, medical files, school enrollment forms, every piece of paper that had my name listed as Ruby's mother. My lawyer said documentation was critical, so I needed to gather it all. I called Ruby's pediatrician office the next morning and requested copies of all her medical records. The receptionist asked why I needed them, and I said I was updating my files. She said they'd be ready in a few days. I called the daycare next and asked for copies of the original enrollment paperwork from 5 years ago. The director sounded confused but said she'd look in their archives. Ruby's kindergarten was easier since everything was recent. I filled out a records request form and they said I'd have copies within a week. Each phone call felt like gathering evidence for a trial, which I guess it was. 2 days later, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. A man's voice said he was Holden Thorne, Elena's father. He said he worked in the hospital administration, and he'd been thinking about what my parents did with Ruby's medical records. He said falsifying medical documents was serious, that it could constitute fraud. He offered to help me get documentation, and said he'd be willing to provide a professional statement about the implications of what my parents did. I thanked him and gave him my lawyer's contact information. Having someone with medical administration experience on my side felt huge. That same afternoon, a certified letter arrived at Elena's apartment addressed to me. It was from my parents' lawyer. I opened it with shaking hands. The letter offered a settlement where my parents would pay for me to finish college at any school I wanted, plus living expenses, in exchange for Ruby and my silence. The letter used careful language about moving forward as a family, and suggested we could all put this unfortunate situation behind us if I stopped making accusations and returned to the original arrangement. They were literally trying to buy Ruby and my compliance. I felt sick reading it. They still thought they could control me with money. I called my lawyer immediately and read her the letter. She was quiet for a moment, then said accepting their offer would mean giving up any claim to Ruby and potentially letting them continue controlling my life. She explained that settlements like this often included non-disclosure agreements that would prevent me from ever talking about what happened. She said we had a strong case if we wanted to fight, but it would be difficult and expensive. Family court cases could drag on for months. My parents had money for good lawyers. She asked what I wanted to do. I told her I wanted to fight. Ruby deserved better than parents who would trade her for silence. The next few days were hard. Ruby was adjusting to kindergarten and processing everything she'd learned, and it was too much for a 5-year-old. She had a really bad day where she came home from the school and just lost it at Elena's apartment. She started throwing her toys across the room and screaming that everyone lied to her. She said she didn't know who her real family was and she hated everyone. I tried to calm her down, but she pushed me away. Finally, I just sat on the floor near her and let her throw things and scream. When she wore herself out, I held her while she cried. I told her it was okay to be angry, that what happened to both of us wasn't fair. I said she could be mad at me and my parents and everyone because we all messed up. She cried until she fell asleep in my arms. Elena helped me clean up the thrown toys and neither of us said anything. The child psychologist called me that evening for an update. I told her about Ruby's meltdown, and she said that kind of reaction was normal and actually healthy. Ruby needed to express her anger. The psychologist said Ruby needed stability and consistency right now more than anything. She said whoever ended up as Ruby's primary guardian, the transition needed to be handled carefully to avoid more trauma. She emphasized that Ruby shouldn't be bounced between homes or used as a bargaining chip. I promised her that wouldn't happen. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay on Elena's couch staring at the ceiling thinking about the anniversary party. Maybe I should have found a gentler way to tell Ruby the truth. Maybe I could have sat her down privately instead of revealing everything in front of 200 people. Ruby's pain was the hardest consequence to bear. I knew the lie couldn't continue forever, but watching her suffer because of how I chose to end it was crushing. Around 3 a.m, I got up and went to the bathroom. I sat on the floor and just cried as quietly as I could. I didn't want to wake Ruby or Elena. But Elena must have heard something because she came in and sat down next to me. She didn't ask what was wrong, just sat with me while I cried. Finally, she said I was also a victim in this situation. She reminded me that I was barely an adult when my parents trapped me in their scheme. She said I did the best I could with an impossible situation, and Ruby would understand that someday. She said I needed to stop blaming myself for my parents' choices. My phone buzzed the next morning with a text from my cousin. She said several relatives had been talking privately about my parents' behavior. People were starting to remember other times my parents prioritized their image over family, and the pattern was becoming clear. She said my aunt remembered how my parents refused to help my uncle when he lost his job, because they didn't want people knowing they had family financial problems. My cousin said relatives were realizing the anniversary party revelation wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a bigger pattern of my parents caring more about appearances than actual family. I checked my phone the next morning and found a voicemail from my dad's office. It was from the receptionist saying Dad needed to call back right away about an urgent matter. I texted him asking what was going on, but he didn't respond. 2 hours later, my cousin sent me a screenshot of a text chain between family members. Apparently, word had reached Dad's law firm about what happened at the anniversary party. Conrad Powell had called an emergency meeting with the senior partners. My cousin said her mom heard from someone who knew someone at the firm that they were discussing whether Dad's personal conduct reflected poorly on the firm's reputation. I sat on Elena's couch reading and rereading that message. The firm cared about their image just like my parents cared about theirs. Now Dad was facing the same kind of judgment he'd forced me to endure for 5 years. Ruby came out of Elena's bedroom rubbing her eyes and asking for breakfast. I made her cereal and tried to act normal while my mind raced through what this meant. If Dad lost his job or had to step back from the firm, maybe my parents would finally understand what they'd put me through. The professional consequences they'd been so desperate to avoid were happening anyway, because they'd gotten caught. Around noon, there was a knock on Elena's door. I looked through the peephole and saw my mom standing there alone. No dad, no lawyer. She looked exhausted with dark circles under her eyes and her hair pulled back messily. I opened the door but kept the chain lock on. Mom asked if we could talk privately. She said she wanted to explain her side of things. I looked back at Elena, who was sitting with Ruby on the couch. Elena nodded and said she'd keep Ruby occupied. I let my mom inside and we went to the kitchen while Elena turned on a cartoon for Ruby in the living room. Mom sat down at the small kitchen table and put her head in her hands for a moment before looking up at me. She started talking about how she panicked when she found out she was pregnant at 45. She said she felt like her whole career would be over if people at her company knew. She'd worked so hard to get to regional director and she was afraid everyone would see her as careless or unprofessional. She talked about how society judges older mothers and how she couldn't handle the whispers and the looks. I listened without interrupting, and when she finished, I told her I understood being scared. Anyone would be scared in that situation. But she made me carry the burden of her fear for 5 entire years. She stole my early 20s, my education, my friendships, and my reputation to protect herself. That wasn't something I could just forgive because she finally admitted she was scared. I told her she had options. She could have been honest. She could have handled the judgment herself instead of forcing it onto me. She chose the easy path for herself and made my life hell. Mom's face crumpled and she admitted that she knew what they did was wrong. But she said she was terrified of losing Ruby completely now. She kept saying Ruby was her daughter, and she loved her even if she went about everything in the worst possible way. Her voice broke when she talked about Ruby. I could see she genuinely cared about Ruby, even though she'd made terrible choices. I told Mom that I loved Ruby too. That was exactly why I couldn't let her grow up believing lies anymore. Ruby deserved to know who her real parents were, and to have an honest family even if that family was messy and imperfect. I said Ruby was already confused and hurt, and continuing the lie would only make it worse. Mom wiped her eyes and said she understood, but she didn't know how to fix any of this. She asked what I wanted to happen. I told her I wanted Ruby to know the truth, and I wanted my life back. I wanted to finish school properly and have people know I wasn't actually a teen mom who ruined everything. I wanted Ruby to have a relationship with both of us, but one based on honesty. Mom nodded slowly and said she'd talk to Dad about how to move forward. She left a few minutes later looking smaller somehow, like the weight of what they'd done was finally hitting her. That afternoon, my phone rang with an unknown number. I answered, and a woman's voice said she was Suzanne Thorne. I recognized the name immediately as one of Mom's work colleagues who'd been at the anniversary party. Suzanne said she'd been thinking about the party nonstop since it happened. She told me she'd known my mom for 15 years, and she was ashamed that she never questioned the story about me being a teen mom. She said looking back there were signs that didn't add up, but she'd just accepted what my parents told her. Suzanne said if it would help my case, she was willing to testify about my parents' deception. She said she remembered specific conversations where my parents talked about their burden of supporting their teen daughter, and she could document dates and details. I thanked her and said I'd pass her information to my lawyer. After we hung up, I sat there surprised that someone from my parents' circle was actually willing to help me. It felt like maybe people were starting to see through my parents' carefully maintained image. My lawyer called me later that week and said she'd arranged a mediation session. She explained that a mediator was a neutral third party who specialized in complex family custody situations. The mediator would try to help us reach an agreement without going to court. My parents and their lawyer had agreed to attend. The session was scheduled for the following Tuesday at a mediation office downtown. My lawyer said to prepare myself because my parents would likely try to make me look bad. She reminded me we had strong documentation on our side. The days leading up to the mediation felt long and tense. I kept Ruby on a routine at Elena's apartment and tried to keep things calm for her. She was doing better with her therapist, but still had moments where she'd get upset and ask why her family lied to her. Each time it happened, I felt the weight of what we'd all put her through. Tuesday arrived and I got dressed in professional clothes that Elena helped me pick out. My lawyer met me in the lobby of the mediation office. She went over what to expect one more time. We walked into a conference room where my parents were already sitting with their lawyer. Dad wouldn't look at me. Mom's eyes were red like she'd been crying. The mediator was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and a calm presence. She introduced herself and explained the ground rules. Everyone would get a chance to speak. The goal was to find a solution that prioritized Ruby's well-being. She said we'd start by hearing from each side about what they wanted as an outcome. My parents' lawyer went first. He painted me as vindictive and unstable. He said I'd caused a public scene at a family celebration and traumatized a 5-year-old child. He claimed I was too young and immature to understand the complexities of the situation. He said my parents had supported me financially through college, and I was being ungrateful. He suggested I was having some kind of breakdown and needed psychological evaluation before any custody decisions were made. I sat there listening to him twist everything and make me sound crazy and cruel. My hands were shaking under the table. Then my lawyer spoke. She pulled out the folder of documentation we'd gathered. She showed the mediator Ruby's daycare enrollment forms with my name listed as mother, medical records with my name, school documents with my name. She explained how my parents had systematically committed fraud by falsifying these documents. She presented the recording I'd made of Dad threatening to call the police and report me for kidnapping, while simultaneously admitting Ruby was his daughter, not his granddaughter. She showed social media posts where my parents took credit for being supportive grandparents and were accepted praise for their sacrifices. She laid out a timeline of 5 years where my parents controlled my life through financial leverage and destroyed my reputation to protect their own. She explained how I'd lost educational opportunities, friendships, and my entire early 20s because my parents forced me into this role. When she finished, the room was quiet. The mediator looked at the documents for a long moment. The mediator turned to my parents and asked them directly why they thought this arrangement was acceptable. Dad started talking about how they were just trying to support me through college and help me have opportunities. The mediator cut him off. She said putting your child's name on legal documents for a baby that isn't theirs isn't support. She said threatening to withhold college funding unless someone lies for you isn't support. She used the word coercion. Dad's face turned red and he started to argue, but the mediator held up her hand. She said we weren't here to debate whether what happened was wrong because the documentation made that clear. We were here to figure out what happened next for Ruby's sake. She asked my parents what they wanted. Mom spoke up for the first time and her voice was shaky. She said Ruby was her daughter and she loved her and she was terrified of losing her completely. She admitted they'd made mistakes but said taking Ruby away from the only parents she'd known would traumatize her more. She said they were willing to work with me, but they needed to remain Ruby's primary caregivers. The mediator wrote notes and then turned to me. She asked what I wanted. I said I wanted Ruby to know the truth and to have an honest relationship with everyone. I said I wanted to finish my education properly without the burden of being listed as Ruby's mother. I said I wanted regular time with Ruby because I loved her and she was my sister. I said my parents needed to publicly acknowledge what they'd done, so my reputation could be repaired. The mediator nodded and said she'd prepare some options for us to consider. I watched Mom's face crumple as the mediator waited for her response. Her hands twisted in her lap and she looked smaller than I'd ever seen her. She took a shaky breath and started talking about how scared she was when she found out she was pregnant at 45. She said all her colleagues were younger women climbing the corporate ladder, and she felt like being pregnant at her age made her look careless and unprofessional. She talked about how she'd worked so hard to build her reputation as someone who had it all together, someone who made smart decisions, and an unplanned pregnancy didn't fit that image. Then her voice broke and she admitted she couldn't face the judgment, so she made me take it instead. She said she knew it was wrong, but she was too ashamed to be honest, and by the time she realized how badly she'd hurt me, she was in too deep to fix it. The mediator wrote notes without looking up, and I sat there feeling strange because this was the first time Mom had actually explained herself instead of making excuses. It didn't make what she did okay, but at least it was honest. The mediator asked if Ruby's therapist had provided any documentation about how all this was affecting her. My lawyer pulled out a folder and handed over several pages. The mediator read through them carefully while we all sat in uncomfortable silence. She explained that the therapist had outlined Ruby's current state pretty clearly. Ruby was confused about who her real family was and felt betrayed by everyone she trusted. She was having nightmares and acting out at the school because she didn't know how to process what she'd learned. The therapist said Ruby needed honest relationships with both me and our parents moving forward, but she'd been seriously harmed by years of deception. She recommended family therapy for all of us and said Ruby needed stability while she worked through her feelings. The mediator looked at my parents and said this wasn't just about what they wanted anymore. Ruby's well-being had to come first, and that meant acknowledging the damage that had been done. The mediator spent the next 20 minutes laying out a proposal. She said my parents would keep legal custody of Ruby since they'd been her primary caregivers for 5 years, and removing her completely would cause more trauma. But all documents would be corrected to show I was Ruby's sister, not her mother. I'd have guaranteed visitation rights that my parents couldn't take away, with a schedule we'd all agree to. She said this plan recognized reality while giving Ruby the stability she needed during her adjustment period. My parents would pay for family therapy and for correcting all the legal documents they'd falsified. They'd also fund my education at a better school since they'd used college money to control me. The mediator made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. She said if we couldn't agree to something like this, we'd end up in court, and a judge would likely be much harder on my parents given the evidence of fraud and coercion. Over the next few weeks, word spread through my parents' social and professional circles about what really happened. I started hearing about it from relatives who got phone calls from mutual friends asking questions. My aunt told me that people were talking at her book club after someone mentioned seeing posts about the anniversary party drama. Dad's law firm became a source of gossip when clients started asking partners about the situation. I heard through Elena that her dad Holden had been at a business lunch where someone brought up the story about a lawyer who forced his daughter to pretend his child was hers. Mom's office was apparently buzzing with conversations about whether anyone had suspected the truth. Suzanne stopped liking Mom's social media posts, and I noticed other colleagues did the same. The carefully constructed image my parents had built for 5 years was falling apart as people realized they'd been manipulated into praising parents who were actually abusing their daughter. Dad came home one afternoon looking like he'd aged 10 years. He went straight to his study, and I heard him on the phone with someone, his voice tight and angry. Later that evening, he told Mom that Conrad had called him into a meeting with the management committee. They'd asked him to consider early retirement. Conrad had been careful with his words, saying they couldn't force him out, but they were making it very clear that his partnership wasn't valued anymore. The firm was worried about the ethical questions surrounding his personal conduct. Dad kept saying it wasn't fair, that his personal life shouldn't affect his professional standing, but Mom just stared at him. She asked how he thought I felt when my personal reputation got destroyed because of their lies. Dad didn't have an answer for that. A week later, Mom came home from work looking defeated. She'd been expecting a promotion to vice president that she'd been working toward for 2 years. Her boss had taken her to lunch and explained that the position was going to someone else. He didn't say it was because of the situation with Ruby, but Mom knew. She told me about it that night when I came to pick up some of my things from the house. She said this was exactly what she'd been afraid of, that having Ruby had ruined her career anyway. I looked at her and felt nothing but exhaustion. She'd sacrificed my reputation and 5 years of my life to protect her career, and now she was losing it regardless. The difference was that she'd made her own choices and was facing consequences she deserved, while I'd had no choice at all. I refused to let myself feel guilty about what my parents were going through. They'd had 5 years to come clean and chose not to. They'd had countless opportunities to tell the truth before it got this bad, but they only cared about the consequences now because they got caught publicly, instead of being able to control how the story came out. If I hadn't spoken up at that anniversary party, they would have kept the lie going for another 13 years like they'd planned. They weren't sorry about what they did to me. They were sorry they couldn't manage the fallout the way they wanted to. Every time Mom tried to talk about how hard things were for them at work, I reminded her that she'd made me miss classes, lose friendships, and get judged by strangers for years. Every time Dad complained about Conrad and the firm, I pointed out that he'd threatened to call the police on me for kidnapping when Ruby was his own daughter. They wanted sympathy, but they'd used up any I might have had. The major confrontation happened on a Saturday when my parents showed up at Elena's apartment unannounced. They'd been calling and texting all week trying to discuss the mediator's proposal, but I'd been avoiding them because I needed space to think. Dad pounded on the door until Elena let them in, looking nervous. My parents stood in her tiny living room and demanded to know what I wanted from them. Dad's face was red and his voice was loud as he said they'd agreed to the custody arrangement and the therapy and paying for school, so what else did I need? Mom stood beside him with her arms crossed, waiting for my answer. I took a breath and told them I wanted them to publicly acknowledge what they did. Not just to family and close friends, but actually admit it. I wanted them to apologize to Ruby properly, to sit down with her and take responsibility for lying to her for 5 years. And I wanted them to stop trying to make themselves the victims in this situation, because they weren't. They'd made choices that hurt Ruby and me, and they needed to own that, instead of constantly talking about how hard things were for them now. Dad immediately said that a public acknowledgement would destroy what was left of their reputation. He said they'd already lost enough, that his career was basically over, and Mom's was damaged, and making some kind of public statement would just make everything worse. I stared at him and said they'd destroyed my reputation without any hesitation when it served their purposes. They'd let everyone think I was a teen mom who'd ruined my life. They'd let professors assume I was irresponsible and let relatives whisper about me at family gatherings. They'd stood by while my grandmother sent me adoption pamphlets and my friends' parents called me a bad influence. They'd done all of that to me without caring how it felt, so they could handle experiencing a tiny fraction of what they'd put me through. Mom started crying and Dad told me I was being cruel, but I didn't back down. I said they'd been cruel to me for 5 years and now they had to deal with the consequences of their own actions. Mom's voice was barely a whisper when she finally spoke. She said what they did to me was wrong and she was sorry. She wasn't crying anymore, just looking at me with exhausted eyes. She said she knew it wasn't enough and she knew it didn't fix anything, but she needed me to know that she understood they'd hurt me badly. It wasn't the full public apology I'd asked for. It wasn't her standing up in front of everyone who judged me and admitting the truth. But it was the first time either of my parents had actually said the words, without immediately following them with excuses about being scared, or protecting their careers, or doing what they thought was best. It was the first real acknowledgement that they'd done something terrible to their own daughter, And even though it was small and private and not nearly enough, it was something. Over the next 2 weeks, we hammered out the details with lawyers sitting across from each other at a conference table. My parents agreed to keep legal custody of Ruby, but all her documents would list me as her sister going forward. They'd pay for me to transfer to a better university 2 hours away with a strong program in my field. I'd get Ruby for regular weekend visits while she adjusted to everything. The lawyer typed up every detail while my parents sat there looking tired and defeated. Dad signed first without saying anything. Then Mom signed with her hand shaking a little. The agreement said they had to attend family therapy sessions with Ruby and me every other week. They also had to send a written statement to close family and friends telling the truth about what they'd done. It wasn't the full public apology I wanted, but my lawyer told me this was as good as it would get without going to court. I signed the papers knowing it was workable even if it wasn't perfect. What mattered was that Ruby would finally have honest relationships with everyone. Ruby's therapist worked with her on understanding the new family structure. During our first session after the agreement, Ruby kept looking at me and starting to say mama before catching herself. She'd get frustrated and her face would scrunch up like she might cry. The therapist gave her permission to take her time learning the new words. Ruby started calling me by my actual name during our second week of therapy, though she slipped up at least once every visit. Her therapist said she was doing really well considering how much had changed so fast. One afternoon, Ruby told the therapist she felt better not having to remember which story to tell which people anymore. She said keeping track of the lies made her head hurt, and now she could just tell the truth. I watched her sitting in the chair swinging her legs, and felt relieved that she seemed lighter somehow. I applied to 3 universities with strong programs, and got accepted to my top choice. My parents transferred the tuition payment in early August, just like they'd promised. I packed up my stuff from their house while Ruby watched from my bedroom doorway asking when she'd see me again. I told her every weekend we'd have sister time together. For the first time in 5 years, I drove to campus without having to arrange daycare pickup or worry about missing classes for Ruby's doctor appointments. My schedule was completely mine. I registered for a full course load, including 2 classes I'd wanted to take for years but couldn't, because of timing conflicts with Ruby's needs. Walking into my first lecture hall felt different knowing I was there just as a student, not as the girl everyone assumed was an irresponsible teen mom. Nobody looked at me with pity or judgment. I was just another person trying to get a degree. Elena and I stayed in touch through daily texts and video calls. She drove up to visit me at my new campus one Saturday, and we got coffee at the student center. She told me she was proud of me for standing up to my parents and fighting for both Ruby and myself. She said watching everything happen made her realize she'd been avoiding hard conversations in her own life because it was easier to keep the peace. She'd started being more honest with her own parents about things she disagreed with, instead of just going along to avoid conflict. We sat there for 3 hours catching up on everything, and it felt good to have a friendship based on truth instead of the fake story my parents had created. She promised to keep visiting regularly, and told me I could call her anytime I needed to talk through the complicated feelings about my family. Ruby and I figured out our new relationship as sisters over video calls 3 times a week, and weekend visits twice a month. At first, she seemed confused about how to act around me, like she wasn't sure if the rules had changed about everything. I told her we were still the same people who loved each other. We just had honest words for our relationship now. During one of our calls, she asked if she could tell me about a boy in her class who was mean to her at recess. I listened and gave her advice just like I always had. She seemed relieved that I still cared about the small details of her life. After a few months, she told me she was glad she knew the truth now, even though learning it had been really hard and scary. She said she liked having a big sister and knowing her real mom and dad, instead of thinking everyone was lying to her all the time. My grandmother became the person who made sure my parents followed through on everything they'd promised. She called them every week to check that they were attending therapy sessions and treating both Ruby and me right. She told them straight out that she was watching to make sure they didn't try to manipulate either of us anymore. She started coming to some of Ruby's therapy sessions as support, and the therapist said having her there helped Ruby feel like she had people on her side. Grandmother told my parents during one family session that they needed to do better and stop making excuses for what they'd done. She said she'd believed their lies for 5 years, and she was angry at herself for not questioning things sooner, but she was angrier at them for putting everyone in that position. My parents sat there and took it because they knew grandmother meant every word. I met someone in my biology class during my second month at the new university. We got paired together for a lab project and ended up talking after class about things beyond just the assignment. He asked me to get dinner one night, and I said yes. When he asked about my family, I told him the truth from the beginning about my parents and Ruby and everything that had happened. He listened without judging and said that sounded really complicated, but he was glad I'd stood up for myself and my sister. It felt amazing to not have to maintain a fake story about being a teen mom or worry about him finding out the truth later. We started dating officially after a few weeks, and for the first time I was in a relationship where I could just be myself without hiding huge parts of my life. Professor Archer reached out when she heard through the college network that I'd transferred to a better program. She asked how she could help me make up for the opportunities I'd missed while everyone thought I was a teen mom. I told her about my interests, and she helped me apply for 3 different scholarships aimed at students who'd overcome major obstacles. She wrote recommendation letters talking about my determination and strength through difficult circumstances. 2 of the scholarships came through, which helped with expenses my parents weren't covering. She also connected me with a competitive summer research program that I'd never thought I could qualify for. When I got the acceptance letter, I called her to say thank you, and she told me she was just helping me access what I'd earned through my own hard work. 6 months after the anniversary party, my parents hosted a small dinner for relatives who hadn't been at the party and didn't know the truth yet. They invited grandmother, my aunt and uncle, and 2 of my cousins with their families. Before everyone arrived, my parents sat down with Ruby and me in the living room and asked if we were ready. Ruby nodded and grabbed my hand. When everyone was there, Dad stood up and said they had something important to share. He explained that Ruby wasn't actually their granddaughter but their daughter, and that they'd forced me to claim her as mine for 5 years. The room went completely silent. My aunt's face went through about 5 different expressions before she finally asked why they would do something like that. Mom explained about being scared of how it would affect their careers. My uncle looked at me and apologized for all the times he'd made comments about me being a young mother. Ruby sat next to me through the whole thing, holding my hand tight. One of my cousins asked Ruby how she was doing with everything, and Ruby said it was hard but better than lying. The dinner was awkward and uncomfortable, but it was necessary. Ruby needed her extended family to know the truth so she didn't have to keep track of different stories with different people. By the end of the night, everyone knew the real situation, and Ruby could just be herself around the whole family. My GPA sits at 3.8 this semester, which feels impossible after years of missed classes and incomplete assignments. I'm taking advanced courses in my major without worrying about picking up Ruby from daycare or missing lectures because she's sick. My study group meets 3 times a week, and they actually know my real story because I can be honest now. Sarah from my ethics class invited me to her apartment last weekend to work on our joint presentation, and when she asked about my family, I told her the truth without having to maintain elaborate lies. She listened and said my parents sound messed up, which was refreshing instead of pitying. I applied for a summer internship at a nonprofit that does family advocacy work, something I never would have considered before because travel was impossible. The application asked about obstacles I'd overcome, and I wrote about the 5 years of forced deception and how it shaped my interest in family rights. 2 weeks later, they called with an offer, saying my personal experience would bring valuable perspective to their work. I accepted immediately and called Ruby to tell her I'd be gone for 8 weeks, but would video chat every night. She got quiet for a minute, then asked if I was coming back, and I promised I always would. My roommate Maya knows everything too, and she doesn't treat me differently because of it. We go to campus events together, and she introduced me to her boyfriend's friend last month. His name is James, and he's studying engineering. And when we got coffee, he asked about my family, and I told him the whole story up front. He didn't run away or make it weird. He just said that took guts to expose and asked if I wanted to see a movie sometime. Ruby comes to visit every other weekend now, taking the campus shuttle with Mom, who drops her off and picks her up without coming inside. Last Saturday, Ruby and I walked around campus and got ice cream from the student union. She held my hand and asked questions about my classes and my friends. We sat on a bench near the library, and she swung her legs and said she liked visiting me here. Then she looked up at me with her serious face and told me she was happy she has a big sister now. She said everything was confusing and scary when she found out the truth, but she likes that our family doesn't have secrets anymore. She said it's better knowing the real story, even though it hurt at first. I felt something shift in my chest hearing her say that, realizing we both got something important from the mess of that anniversary party. The truth was hard and ugly, and it damaged relationships that might never fully heal. But it gave us both the chance to have real, honest relationships instead of ones built on lies. Ruby knows who her parents actually are now, and I'm not carrying around a fake identity that poisoned everything I tried to do. That's worth the destroyed reputations and the family tension and all the awkward conversations we'll keep having for years. Ruby and I can build something genuine now, and that matters more than protecting anyone's image or avoiding difficult truths.